right. And so before we begin, I have the pleasure of introducing Duane Jackson. He is of the Gittimax Gitsan Nation. He has a great background in early education, many different organizations such as Success by Six and Children's First. And he's been a member of the UBC Human Early Learning Partnership Help Aboriginal Steering Committee, ASC, for the past 15 years. And we're very thrilled to have him today to guide us through the session. So I will pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Good day, everybody. For those that didn't meet me yesterday, my name is Riach. My given name is Duane Jackson. Of course, as said, I'm of Gittimax Nation of what is now Old Hazelton. I am Giskas, which is fireweed of the House of Huatzam Laha. And those levels of belonging are everybody talks, wow, that's a lot to live up to. I don't live up to it. I live into it. I said there's a difference, and when we make our decision making process. Thank you all for joining us today to talk about the gifted. And that's the way. That's the only way. Because for us, everybody comes with challenges. Everybody. there, there isn't a person that you are going to get into a relationship with that doesn't have then some things that you're going to need to adjust to, some more than others, right? Not one. And that those are relational properties, and that's what the important piece is. I was actually on my way down for meetings with FSI. I think it was my first meetings with FSI, and I rode on. I was talking to a lady on the ferry going across from Prince Rupert to the airport, and she is talking about my daughter's challenged, and I had to come back. I said, gifted. And she goes, what? I said, well, think about it. I said, how many people do you have for these consults? How many people do you have in the room with you? She goes, well, myself and usually two others. I guess a doctor and a practitioner and maybe a child psychologist, psychiatrist. Says, okay, cool. I said, of those four people in the room, yeah, which one of them sees it differently? Which one sees it in a different light? Which one reacts to things differently? And she looked at me and she was like, just one. I said, yeah, because the other three all see it the same way. The other three are working towards normalcy. I said, relational pieces are really what comes down to normalcy. It's about all things being connected and all things, and embracing the humility that allows you to accept that there are things at play here that you just may not understand. That's fine. That would be every human being in the entire history of human beings. And we seem to be really losing that in our society because we're either one way or this way, my way or the highway, draw a line in the sand. We're adamant about things. None of those four things I just said are relational properties. They are not relational. My way or the highway generally becomes the highway. And it really shows a lack of humility. I've been on a journey with my daughter for the last 10 years. And I didn't become, and I can talk about this. Cooper and I both do this work, so don't you worry about that. I didn't become a student of suicidality or self harm or mental health or any of the other 5 million four letter word anagrams that we seem to be using now. I became a student of Cooper. That's all. I found out what her triggers are. I recognized when she was on her way to being those things. And then I had to calm myself down so I could be in a place to be of service to her. And because that's what we always say about the people that we serve, right? And the people we're in service to. And we have a word. It's actually my niece just got this name. It's we halite. And halite essentially just describes anybody at all. Anybody that makes any kind of action at all, doesn't matter what, how big, how its size, anything like that, does anything at all to ease the journey of another person through their day. That's it. My niece is actually um, uh, practitioner. She's a family doctor, does a lot of this work, and her and I talk about this all the time. And I just love the name for her because it's not just her job and her profession. This is genuinely who she is, and it can happen very simply. It can happen just in a moment when you just move over and make room for somebody on the sidewalk. And the amount of times I hear, especially from our young people, I'm not moving if they don't move. Yeah, why? Why is that? What's the what actually do you get from that? What form of dominance are you gonna bring out of this person that you've never met before in your entire life and you have no idea who they are? And it's just simply half a step to the left or the right, and you have just positively affected this person's life. Yeah. See, relationships take work. See, they are. The relationships are work. Mind you, if you're in a relationship that's work 24/7, I'm gonna say we probably got something to talk about with that relationship because it shouldn't be 24/7. Relationships take work, but you can be relational in a moment. And that's all we're really asking from people is to look at these pieces that we're going to present to you. Do you have to learn them all? Do you have to change your life? Do you have to do all these things? No, 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 no. We have to find a way for these pieces to come together. And if we're talking about relational understanding of things, I'm going to question this society's understanding of relationality because, and I bring this up all the time, this is actually the front of the work I do. Sit still, face forward, don't make a sound, and don't share anything you're feeling with anybody around you is not relational. So when we start talking about the things that we have been taught, we have to start questioning that. And unfortunately, at some points, we have to start questioning the people that taught them to us, even if it's our parents. Yeah. Even my mother was a saint, but I grew up listening to her make racial statements about Indian people until she met them. Now she loves them. Then she loved them up until she made her journey last year. But she had to meet them first, and I heard that, right? And so that confused me because I had many Indian friends. Yeah, many. So it's a lot of stuff like that. So these are the things that we want to bring across as far as the calls to action go. And then any questions at all, please just throw them out there because really this is a path that we're living. It's not we're not. I'm not clocking in at 9 o'clock. Everything that's happening right now in North America, Indigenous peoples have watched happen for 300 years. And it's always the same thing. Once the bully can't bully you, now they're just going to lean into everybody else. That's what happens. Right. So it's all tough stuff that we're dealing with. It's all hard things, hard times, everything like that. But in the end, people ask me what sustains the work I do and what sustains me. There are children involved. That's all I need to know. Sometimes that child is trapped within an adult somewhere, and I try to find that child too. So it's all really important stuff. So Amaya, thank you so much. I'll turn this back over to Heather, and we can get started. And please feel free to ask any questions, please. Amaya, thank you.
Thank you, Duane. Thanks for guiding us with those words and your teachings as we start today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm here from my home office on the Coast Salish land, the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. As I sit here, I can see out the window the groundbreaking Squamish development in False Creek, which is an example of reconciliation in action, and will provide housing for hundreds of people, settlers and First Nations alike. And of course, we at FSI, our work spans the territories across BC, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn on these shared lands. And we honor the resilience and ongoing contributions of Indigenous people across Canada. Before we dive in, just a few housekeepings. The teaching part of today's session will be recorded just like yesterday, but the Q&A will not. That way, so you can feel comfortable participating openly and ask those vulnerable questions. The recording, I will send that to you with a follow-up email, along with the list of supports that you can access if you're feeling triggered or upset from the material that's being shared today. Please keep your microphone muted and to minimize background noise, and you're welcome to turn your camera on if you feel comfortable. It helps us create a sense of connection. And there'll be opportunities after Symbia is finished for reflection and questions. So please use the chat if you'd like to raise your hand or join the discussion. Our second session on reflection, responsibility, and ReconciliACTION is part of our ongoing commitment and learning and unlearning together. This is a space where we can deepen our understanding of Canada's history, the legacy of residential schools, and the path toward truth and reconciliation. We are very fortunate once again to be joined by our speaker, Symbia Barnaby. I'm very glad to be able to introduce her and that she is part of our team. Just as a refresher, Symbia is an Indigenous woman of Haida and Mi'kmaq belonging and descent. She's a mom of 6, a practical nurse, and a traditional helper. She's also a storyteller, a filmmaker, a community researcher, and a fierce advocate for inclusion and healing. Symbia joined us earlier this year as our interim Indigenous practice advisor, and we are so grateful for the wisdom and teaching she has brought to this work. I'll pass it on to Symbia, who'll begin with her own land acknowledgement and guide us into today's session.
How about Heather and how about Duane for helping to bring us into this space in a good way. I'll start out with my introduction and then we'll move on to the education part of this session today. So my given name is Symbia Barnaby. My traditional feasted Haida name is Gugajung, and my ceremony name or my spirit name is Warrior Woman. I currently reside on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Tsimshian people, specifically the 9 tribes of Lachulams and Metlakatla, which is colonially referred to as the city of Prince Rupert, in what is referred to currently as the northwest coast of British Columbia. I've lived here most of my life and have many elders that I answer to, both in the Mi'kmaq, the Haida, and the Tsimshian Nation, and also to the surrounding communities that come and live here on the territories that we share. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the different sections of the Truth and Reconciliation report, the recommendations that came out of that report. So yesterday, I named a couple different things that have been written as a result of the commission coming together. And I'll just refresh your memory that the commission was called together as part of a call to action from the class action suit that went forward from people coming forward to bring the Canadian government and the churches to hold them responsible for abuse and loss and all those things that the way that they were impacted from residential school. So I wanted to start, Heather, if you can go to the next slide. So I'll just move my screen over. So the slide that says Purpose of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Please and thank you. I wanted to start out there today, so you have a little bit of an idea of what were some of the things that they were looked at to be responsible for, or what the hope was from there. So then we can kind of go into the sections after that. Yeah, that's the slide. Perfect. So I wanted to share with you the purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So first off, it was to acknowledge the experiences of the survivors and the impacts and consequences of the Indian residential school system. I know that Duane just said, you know, the use of the word Indian, the only reason why I would use it, many people can feel that it's very derogatory, but I want to share that the only reason why I would use it is in terms of historical references to documents, because we know that it's an inaccurate description of the people that people use to use it to try to make reference to. So I just want to clear that up. So yeah, the first purpose is to acknowledge those experiences. In the past, without people coming forward, there wasn't any record of these experiences. So it was really important for them to have a way to acknowledge that these are what occurred at residential schools all throughout the country. The next purpose is to provide a holistic, safe, culturally appropriate environments to come forward. the commission traveled all across Canada. They set up kind of like community hall sessions where they signed people up, or they opened it up for people to come forward and share how they were impacted historically from residential school. Like I said yesterday, there was a little bit of problems that came out of that, and about listening, and that holding space for people through sharing their stories. It was very heavy and very hard. The third purpose is to facilitate truth and reconciliation events, so that they held them all, like I said, all across Canada. And that was one of the purposes for the TRC Commission coming together. The next one is around educating Canadians about the Indian residential school system and the impacts that it had. So having people being able to travel and talk to communities about the truth of the way people were impacted by going to or attending residential schools, and what the lasting impacts, what are some of the things that we notice in community as a result of it, right? Prior to any kind of conversation around the TRC coming together, this commission coming together, there wasn't public awareness or knowledge about the truth about people's experiences. And it's really important for them to be able to educate Canadians about it. They did develop, I think that there's a website that they had archived people's experiences and things like that for people to go make reference to. This is the next part I was kind of leading into. So being able to create a historical record about the Indian Residential School Survivor Society and its legacy. So understanding that there needs to be somewhere that all these records were housed, right? So all the stories, all the films, all the recordings, having somewhere to bring that and to be able to help quantify it as a historical record is really important. The next purpose of the TRC was to produce a report about the Indian Residential School Survivors system, or school system, I mean, and its ongoing legacy, and make recommendations for reparations to the Canadian government. So they're able to compile all of the stories and in all together, and from that say, what are some of the themes here? What are things that we see that's consistent from everybody's stories? How were people impacted? You know, what were some of the common experiences for people? What are some of the losses that we can quantify from all of these reports? What was something, what are consistent themes that kept popping up? You know, if we're talking about sexual abuse, you know, what was something that was consistent that came up? When we're talking about loss of language, you know, like what were some of the common scenarios that came? You know, there are stories about people, you know, having physical abuse towards them whenever they tried to use their own languages, right? They have records of siblings being split up into different schools or not allowed to see siblings if they were sent to the same schools. They look at what was it, the education that was put upon them, right? We talked about it a little bit yesterday about spiritual abuse. What's consistent? We're not to be talking about our traditional ways that we were living prior to going and attending residential school. We're not to make reference to our spirituality. We're not to make reference to ceremonies that we would attend or ways of life or ways of living prior to, right? So if it's put upon that you're to learn how to pray, learn how to clean, learn how to fix or make things. Remember how I said that they made wares, they made trinkets that could be sold or to help subsidize sometimes. You know, those were all things that they're learning, and how are they impacted? What did they go into this, and what did they lose from it? All of those things are mapped out with being able to listen to all those stories. And that's what helps contribute to the sections that we're going to talk about in a moment. And then the last purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to commemorate survivors and their families. Eventually, you know, there's funds that the Canadian government and different places have put forward, Indian Residential School Survivor Society, different agencies who are saying, hey, like, we need to be able to address this. We need to be able to hold space for residential school survivors to be able to come forward if they want to now that the report's done, right? And how do we hold space for them to heal from the things that were inflicted upon them in their attendance at a residential school? So can we go to the next slide, please, and thank you. So the key areas covered by the calls to action, there's two kind of big sections when you look at the 94 calls. One is around legacy and one is around reconciliation. So legacy is covered in calls to action 1 to 42. So these calls focus on addressing the historical injustices and ongoing impacts of the residential school. They emphasize the need for acknowledgement, education, and reparation for Indigenous communities affected by these policies. And then the next section is around reconciliation. These are calls to action 43 to 94. So these calls aim to implement systemic changes to promote equality and improve the socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous people. They cover various areas, including health, education, justice, and cultural preservation. Next slide, please, and thank you. So if we were to break it down even further, so now we know, there's the historical parts of it, and then moving forward, the reconciliation parts of it, right? What were the legacy that came out of it? What were the results that were learned, and how do we reverse some of those or address some of those, right? So when we look at the different sections, it's really important to kind of have an idea of the different sections so that if you wanted to go back and read it, you'd have kind of an idea of what section am I looking for, right? If you've ever looked at it, it's laid out this way. So there's kind of like a child welfare heading, an education one, so you know which section's kind of going to read through it. So the child welfare one is recommendations 1 through 5. These recommendations are for enacting national standards and legislations related to Aboriginal child welfare. So when you think about it, what does that look like to address some of the ongoing impacts that the child welfare system has on Indigenous families, right? We look at how many kids are in care right now, currently. I remember reading statistics from, I think it was like the 2016 census. They said that currently there are more Indigenous children in the child welfare system than there ever was children at the height of residential school. At the height of residential school era, there were 80 schools running, and there are more kids, Indigenous kids in care right now, 0 to 14, that are in care than there ever were at the height of residential school. So there's a drastic overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system. And you can imagine that if you have a stolen generation, taken from their families, taken from their communities, if they're not learning cultural ways, living on the land, living and understanding roles, responsibilities, respect, relationality in community, and then you put upon them teachings that don't belong to them, and then they try to return back to community or they're brought back to community, what could that look like? Right? And when you're coping through trauma and there's use of substance, what can continue to happen with their children when those children who went to residential school have children themselves, right? And then also we look at 60 Scoop as a reference to, children who came back home after residential school started to close down, and then they would pull them from community and put them into to foster homes, often, without families' permission, without just cause all the time. And then it's continued to ripple out that our children are we continue to normalize removing Indigenous children from Indigenous families and communities and normalizing it as if it's okay, instead of looking at what are some of the impacts that have come as a result of residential school, right? So those sections, that section of child welfare recommend or calls to actions 1 to 5 address those. The next one is around education, so 6 to 12. These are looking at measures to ensure Indigenous children have access to equitable education. If you look at some of the things that we talked about yesterday, what were some of the things that they talked about? These are industrial schools. They teach kids how to make things, how to do things part of the day. and then they make them do things the rest of the day, right? That's the education that those families received. And then looking at the underfunding on reserve for Indigenous children to attend schools, there is a huge gap in equity in funding. And when you look at how do we get kiddos who are in community up to the same educational outcomes as their non-Indigenous counterparts, that's the section that that addresses those gaps. How do we ensure that Indigenous culture, ways of knowing and being, are also centered in education for them and for the rest of Canadian society? The next one is language and culture. So calls to action 13 to 17. These are initiatives to revitalize and protect Indigenous languages and cultural practices. When you look at it, which I made reference to it before, there are stories of people, horror stories of people being punished because they're speaking their own language. And think of all the different languages of the children that came to residential school. That's that's their primary language that they spoke, and then they're now taught to speak English only. How do you go back into community and relate to anybody? How do you communicate your needs, your wants, your desires? How do you communicate anything to your family, to your extended family, to your nation, to your tribe? You have the inability to communicate because you no longer have your language. I said look how fast it took for a generation to have no language, right? My mom spoke Mi'kmaq, then French, then English. Now she only speaks English. And I only know English and French because my mom put me into French immersion. And I think about that. That's one generation done. I don't have access to my language. I don't live on my traditional territory. My children don't know Sim Alech. That's the language of that's paternally the language that they're connected to. So they have that section is specifically to address that revitalization and protection of Indigenous languages all across Canada, because there's context that's lost, there's ceremony that's lost, there's spirituality that's lost without the context of that language. So it's really important for cultural practices and language preservation. The next one is around health. The next section is 18 to 24. These actions are to address the health inequities and ongoing impacts on Indigenous communities. So as you can imagine, the different things as a result that have happened through residential school, there's stories of starvation. There's stories of being fed moldy or rotten food. There are stories of people being fed vomit because they've eaten something that was rotten and then they were forced to eat it. There are people who got TB while they were there, influenza, lots of different, sicknesses that they would have caught while they were there. You can imagine the mental health and the trauma that Indigenous people, by bearing witness to things that happened while they were there, abuse that happened, trying to keep themselves safe or protected, or trying to help keep their friends or extended family members safe and protected. And then also the loss, right? The loss that I share this with every single person. Every Indigenous person has some form of loss and um, have had experiences some form of trauma, at least one form of trauma, or compound trauma, or intergenerational trauma, or lateral violence as a result of things that were learned and put upon in our grandparents, great-grandparents, aunties, uncles, parents at residential school. So that section addresses the health inequities and looks at the gaps and looks also at bringing Indigenous wisdom and ways of knowing and being and healing into healthcare spaces. The next section is on justice. So those are calls to action 25 to 42. Yeah, these are recommendations for improving the justice system's responsiveness to Indigenous issues. I remember reading one of them, I think it was yesterday, thanks to Milani. It was around, or no, I was doing the slides for tomorrow up, and I was reading the ones around FASD and talking about, some of the things that have directly come out of experiences at residential school, and then if those people in turn, are involved with the justice system, what does that look like? What can people look into and consider the impacts, the historical impacts on those people because of their attendance at residential school? Yeah. So that's that section. The last one is reconciliation. So that's calls to action 43 to 94. And these are calls for federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments to work together and for institutions like museums, archives, and post-secondary institutions to implement reconciliation efforts. This one's really important. There's calls to action for every organization that's actually contained in that. And I was attending a workshop series this last little bit about the 94 calls to action, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And they are really making sure that people understand, as Canadians and as organizations, what are we called upon to do as an organization, to make sure that we look at, is there Indigenous employees there? What do we know about cultural competency as an organization? What do we know about the historical impacts? What do we know about how do we get our employees to have that training so that there's cultural capacity and cultural safety in workplaces? So those are the sections. So you can imagine tomorrow we'll make references to specific ones as named in our commitment to truth and reconciliation. But this gives you a broad idea of the different sections that are named within the TRC calls to action. I'm going to go to the next slide, please, Heather. And I am mindful of the time. I've got 2 slides and then we've got question time. So please bear with me. So I think it's important to also point out some of the barriers to reconciliation. So we talked a little bit about some of the experiences that people had at residential school. We look at those sections. Why are they named? And it's important to also understand some of the barriers that in order for us to be able to act on and be able to build strategies around, we need to understand what can we be coming up against sometimes, right? So one of those things is residential school denialism, and I'll unpack that further in the next slide. But it's really important to kind of understand that there are people out there that just outright deny that residential schools either happened or downplaying the severity of the abuse or the loss that people endured, or paint it to be a completely different picture than what the experiences were and named from people who have the lived experience. The other barrier is around paternalistic attitudes, right? We know better as a society that this, was a good thing for Indigenous people. We also look at, the Canadian government. We know what's best for our country. We know what's best for the people. So having that paternalistic attitude as a country, how do we go back and say that there's Indigenous sovereignty? There's Indigenous nations that should be able to they do have the innate right, but that it's recognized that they have the innate right to govern themselves and what they want and to identify priorities as a community, as a nation. What do they want for themselves and not to be dictated to from a Canadian government? Other barriers is ongoing systemic injustices. If you're looking at truth and reconciliation and you're one human being, it feels overwhelming. And you think, what one little person can do? I remember reading this quote not too long ago, and it was like, when we think I'm only one person and what can I do, and think that was a 8.2 billion or however many people there are on this earth, if all of them are saying the same thing, oh, well, I'm only one person, and they don't do anything, think if we all said we think that we could do something, the impact and change that could make, right? So we oftentimes look at, oh, wow, this is a whole justice system, or it's a whole education system, or it's a whole social welfare system, or a whole health system. We can get bogged down on thinking, how can we make any kind of impact, right? Because we are going up against a system. The next one is empty gestures without meaningful change. We look at currently one of the things that's going on right now with the Canadian government. They have Bill 5. I can't remember all the bills. There's a couple of them that are going on right now. But they're talking about fast tracking development projects, and ones that are of public or of national interest, right? They're going and saying, on one hand, we're going to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which talks about the prior informed consent, right? Before the consultation needs to happen, they need to say yes, and they need to have all the information, and then they go and turn around and they make bills that supersede those things. So how do we as a country say we're committed to signing on this United Nations rights of a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and then turn around and do a bill that actually cancels it out? That's really silly, right? But that's one of a prime example of this, empty gestures. And the other is lack of real allyship. We talked a little bit about it with Elder Diana yesterday. I really thought that was important. Where she talked about there's different things like, prejudice and intolerance and racism, and all those things are barriers of getting in the way of becoming an ally. And I talked a little bit about accomplice, right? What do accomplices do? Their bodies are there alongside the people that are doing the work too. Allyship is I'm willing to put, amplify voices. I'm willing to bring you into spaces of influence. But accomplices are out there doing the work of systemic, like dismantling, right? So that calling on allies and trying to get allies educated and motivated and helping them to be in spaces that is going to make effective change, that it can be a barrier, because that's a lot of teaching, a lot of emotional labor that's being asked of from Indigenous people to help call their allies together. Last page, if you want to go to it, and then we can start our discussion after this. So I want to just touch really quick on residential school denialism. So we have a little bit of some thoughts here that's really important to point out, because I think right before, like, we're going to go into the session tomorrow, and we're going to talk about how do we as FSI, how do we as staff start to look at these calls to action, and how do we carry them out in our own work and in other spaces that we're in, right? So it's really important to understand some of the thoughts, the counter thoughts to what we're trying to actually accomplish. So residential school denialism is one of those things. The first part of it, these are different aspects of residential school denialism and how they might show up. So there are many people that want to deny that there was any kind of form of genocide that occurred as a result of residential schools. A lot of people think that genocide can only be a physical, like a ending, mass ending of life of a people, and that's their only understanding or concept of genocide. And it's important to understand that there's many things that contribute to that concept, and where did it come from, and how it was developed, and all the different steps of what the person who originally coined that term genocide, what they said needed to happen. There's, I think it's like 8 stages or 10 stages of genocide, and Canada's has all of them, all 10 of them, right? If you were to be curious and to look them up. But it's important to understand that there's physical, biological, and cultural aspects of genocide, and that all of those things were met by Canada. So a lot of people want to deny that there was any real impact on Indigenous people. The other one is the common phrase is, they're like any other boarding schools. We have boarding schools currently right now, and that's where we send wealthy families send their children, because they know that that's the top place for education. There's a complete difference between the boarding schools that exist in this moment and the concept around them. They're not for assimilation of a people. They're not contributing to genocide of a people. Residential schools, like I said, it consisted of learning skills for 30 minutes or half of the day, and then working half the day. That's not the same as residential or boarding schools that you would attend now. The other saying goes, it taught new skills. They prioritized Western values and ideas and ideologies about workers and working the land, and put upon those skills upon the people who knew the land and lived and had different relationship with the land. So to say, oh, this new skills is very paternalistic. Well, we know better. We know that this is the skills that you should be learning, and not valuing or taking into consideration the wisdom and knowledge Indigenous people had, because they had an intimate relationship with the land. The other one too is there's a saying that they had good intentions, right? Those nuns, those preachers, those priests, those teachers, they all had good intentions. They wanted to, educate these poor little Indian kids. That's the idea, right? Oh, they had good intentions, which often denies any kind of harm, right? It's saying, oh, well, they didn't mean to hurt them, or they didn't understand that they could never have understood the lasting impact or loss that Indigenous people would have suffered. So they had good intentions. So it's forgivable, right? The idea around false equivalency, right? Where they're saying, well, you went to school, we went to school, and we're all equal, right? They don't look at all the inequities that existed and that contributed to lasting inequities that we live with right today. The other one was, it was of the times, right? A lot, that mentality of like, oh, everybody went to some kind of school, and school was really important, and that, it's important that every child went to school, and not understanding the way of life that existed here long before the idea of schools. And I always share this idea. It was gifted to me probably about 13, 14 years ago, is that as Indigenous people, we learn through generational leadership. We learn alongside our aunties, our cousins, our uncles, our brothers, sisters. We learn not in a cohort of the exact same age, but we learn from all different ages, all different stages, in all different places. And that's how we learned, right? And we learned by doing. So it's completely different to value sitting in a classroom for 8 hours and studying concepts. Instead of hands-on doing, learning from doing, right? The next one is demand for civility. There's a huge misconception that Indigenous people weren't civilized, right? How many times do we hear that trope, or that stereotype of Indigenous people being savages? There's no order. There's no governance. It was just wild people living out in the bush, right? That was the idea or concept that they tried to push. And look at all the Western movies that they had, the cowboys and Indians. This was what was visible and in people's mind, etched in people's mind, about who Indigenous people were. There was no depth to or understanding about our governance structure, our ancestral matriarchal law, master carver's law, natural law, all the laws that we lived by and were governed by long before colonization happened, right? And then the last one is outright denial and misrepresentation. There are many people. Heather and I were just mentioning. I think it was Heather. Oh no, I was talking to one lady this morning. We're talking about residential school and talking about the many people that have platforms like on podcasts and stuff, who openly talk about, oh, that didn't happen. There are people that are in British Columbia ridings in provincial government that deny that anything happened, that are saying, hey, look at the Kamloops, that in Kamloops, that those aren't actually child remains. Those are just, mark, or I forgot the word for it now, but trying to say, hey, that there was never any children that died there. And from that, put a blanket understanding all across Canada that, oh, well, if this isn't true, then all of them can't be true. No kids died there, right? So trying to minimalize any kind of travesty, right? And then also misrepresent using all the rest of those quotes that I used up there. Well, it was a good thing for Indigenous people. This was a value to them. Or I know a guy who went to residential school, and he said it was really beneficial to him. He got scholarships from that, blah, blah, blah. And look at him now, like using stories of resiliency and of exceptionalism as a way to deny that there was any lasting impacts or effects on people who actually had lived experiences at residential school. So next slide is just we're if we want to stop the recording, we're going to start to the question and answer part of it. So
Yeah.